So good evening. Madison DX Club is really happy to welcome back Don K4ZA. He was a presenter a couple of years ago, I guess it was,
Right.
and one of our more watched presentations that we've had over the last few years. And I asked Don to come back and talk about, maintaining our towers that are responsible for our antennas and our systems and so forth. If you're interested, and you should be, and even if you've seen it, it's probably bears rewatching Don's presentation on safety, especially before you undertake any more work. We thought this was a very timely presentation because you're not going to be doing Beauvais Island the next few days, so now you can start putting pencil to paper and planning for your spring and summer projects to be ready for the summer. Don helped me a few years ago get my tower up. He put his blood and guts in it, literally his blood, because I remember him coming down bleeding from the tower. The tower is still there, Don, and it's a work of art. So thank you very much. So with that, take it away.
All right. Thank you, Kevin. This is I hesitate to begin a presentation with a statement like this, but this is the hardest one I've ever done. It took me a week to put this together. And of course, that calls everything that I say into question, because you're going to go, God, it took the guy a week to come up with this stuff. But the reason it took so long was that Kevin is right. 2 years ago, I did a presentation and I didn't want to quote unquote repeat myself. So I had to keep going back to that quote unquote presentation and notice what I said or what I showed, and try to quote unquote modify it or change it or use something else. So anyway, with that, what I'll talk about is some observations for over 50 years. You probably noticed that, with a white beard and everything, that I'm qualified as a certifiable old fart. But I'll try to talk about some things you should do and some things you should avoid. And I like to, if you've ever been in the military, of course, you recognize the 4 Ps. Proper planning prevents blank, blank, poor performance. So, oh, yes, we're going to cut the top off a little bit. Well, a lot of what I will talk about tonight are things that we take for granted. Hopefully, some of them are things that'll save you some time or money. You probably know a lot of them already, but you could have forgotten some. That's okay. These will just remind you. There'll be tips and topics that just might save a life or at least an injury. Notice I have to say that early because it's already been noted that I came down, Kevin's tower bleeding. I don't know what happened there. I can't remember. Anyway, the point of it is I'll share some things that I've seen in the 50 plus years of doing tower work. And some of them I still see, or there's some do's and don'ts. They're common mistakes and how to avoid them. In other words, we've all been here. We're all guilty of this. You think you know everything until you discover that you don't, and everything works just fine until you discover that it doesn't. Safety is all too often taken for granted by hams or not even considered. And I harp on this a lot. No job is so important, it's got to be done in an unsafe manner. Never rush when doing tower or antenna work. Safety is always your first priority. And believe me, I've encountered situations where the client was not being very safety conscious. Well, let's begin with that. We'll talk about some of those experiences that I've had in the 50 years. Remember, in ham radio, we're in the backyard, with Mo and Larry, and we don't have any government regulations directing us, but it's up to each of us to learn and understand and follow those safe government regulations or working practices. Is the party that you've hired or the person that you want working for you experienced, knowledgeable, and most importantly, insured? The insurance is critical because quite often your homeowner's insurance, while it might pay for the tower that fell over, it's probably not going to pay for the guy who's laying underneath it. Experience. I've been licensed for 60 years. I find that hard to say because it just doesn't seem possible. I mean, it's been a glorious and terrific 60 years, and I've learned a lot, and I've had a lot of fun and gone a lot of neat places and met some tremendous people. But in that time, I've gathered some firsthand experience in building or repairing, erecting almost every kind of tower antenna type that's out there these days. That's valuable to each and every client. And it's a real marketing advantage for me. It represents true value. But before we get into this, let's consider the reason behind maintenance. And that's assuming something has failed to work correctly. You've confirmed that from your station notebook. You do have a station notebook, I hope. Total failure, intermittent failure, or you failed to work Bouvet. But before we go much deeper, let's talk about actual climbing. I hope that's not somebody calling me on the phone. Gee whiz. The key word is connectivity, i.e. being connected to the tower 100% of the time.
Hey, John?
Yeah.
Are you advancing slides? Because we're still seeing your title slide.
Yes, I am. Wow.
We have a picture that says resume slideshow that's superimposed on your first slide. Maybe you've got the same thing there.
No, I'm looking at the various slides. Now what do I do? Now what do I do?
Do you see Do you see a resume slideshow anywhere on your screen?
No, of course not.
Minimize your current screen and see if there's something underneath it.
Well, I don't know how to minimize that because it's all full screen. How do you minimize this? Gee, I wish I was a computer genius. Well, you've got me here. I don't know what to do. I don't even know how to end this now.
Maybe the escape key.
Okay.
There, that took it away. There, now you're in business.
Really?
Yeah, now we see a mannequin with a harness on.
Right. Okay, and you still see me too, I guess. Not that you need to see me for anything.
Well, you're off in a little corner picture.
Right, okay, good. Well, we were talking about personal fall arrest systems. And here's an example of one right here. This is a very typical PFAS. It's the DBI sala system. And it's, let's face it, we might as well consider that the standard of the industry. If you're going to wear a harness, this is the very best one to wear. And if you're going to climb a tower, you've got to be wearing a harness so you can be connected 100% of the time. The old lineman belt, and we all started with that. I have a, Klein lineman belt hanging in my garage. And, I did a lot of work in that thing. But should anything untoward happen, you can fall out of it. You can fall out of it head first or feet first, because it's just wrapped around your waist. And so, you want to have something that, wraps around your legs and wraps around your chest and shoulders, as you can see there. And it's, possible to stay connected to that tower 100% of the time. I don't think of it as a arresting system, though. It's still called a PFAS, but it's going to stop you from it's going to stop your falling progress. But I think of it as a 100% connected safety system. I'm always going to be alert. I'm always going to be attentive. I'm going to be focused on not falling. Technically, I sometimes use the pair of fall arrest lanyards while I climb up or down, but I use the positioning lanyards when working. This has worked well for me for over 30 years on all types of towers. And I also often just work with the positioning lanyard, as it's much, much faster. And not that speed is of the essence, but it saves time and energy. Before climbing, is the tower safe to climb or work on? I assume the slides are changing. We're okay, right?
Yes.
Hello?
I was eating dinner. Yes, it's
Okay, good.
looks perfect. They're changing.
If it's your personal tower, there's not likely going to be any issues at all. But if it's someone else's tower, we're talking about a guide tower, of course, is it plumb? Have you taken a look at the guide tension? Have you looked at the hardware, i.e. the turnbuckles, the thimbles, the shackles, the clamps, and so on? And of course, the question comes to mind, what about weather? Well, common sense should prevail. Granted, I've been on the top of towers in a blinding snowstorm and wind and rain that, most people were in their fallout shelter. But, that's me, and that was, contest conditions or something. You should never work or climb alone. It's just that simple. Common sense should prevail. You should always have a plan, i.e. who's going to do what. If the project's large enough, it means you've got a crew or your buddies or whatever on site. The day will begin with the tailgate meeting, where the day's work is outlined. Who's going to do what and where and how, that kind of stuff. Question always comes up, well, it's my tower. I'm paying the bill. I'm in charge. Well, I'm sorry. The sad reality is the climbers are always in charge. That doesn't mean they're dictatorial or, tyrants, but they determine the order of the work and who does what. Does everyone have a hard hat or other safety equipment, gloves, sunscreen, water? It's important to stay hydrated. Can't mention that enough. And it's also important, of course, to have extra parts on hand. So you got to tell the guys on the ground where those are. What's in the tool bag that I carry up? I get asked that a lot. After these many years of lugging a tool bag with seemingly everything in it, I've limited the tools to a select few, and this is the basic list. I take 2 3/8" ratchet drivers, 1 Craftsman, 1 Snap-on. The Snap-on is by far my favorite, but I take 2 because quite often you encounter the head of a bolt will be a different size from the nut. And let's face it, stopping to change the socket slows you down. I have a variety of 6-point sockets, but these 3 will get you through 99% of the work, 7/16, 3/8, and 1/2 inch. I dearly love, and I can't stress that word enough, gear wrench, open end and box end combination wrenches. And again, 3/8, 7/16, 3/8, and 1/2 inch sizes. Once you use a gear wrench, which is a ratcheting box end wrench, you'll never go back. I take a channel lock 8-inch crescent style wrench, and I use that because it opens up to 1.5 inches. And if you ever have to do any work, up top with the thrust bearing mount, you go, Jesus, look at the head, look at the nuts on these bolts. And then, you're sending down for a socket, and, can you tell that it's 3/4 inch just by eye? Maybe yes, maybe no. But that crescent wrench going open to 1.5 inches solves that problem. Take 2 sets of pliers, a Klein lineman type plier, and then robo grips. The robo grips are important. We'll talk about those in detail a little bit later. I take a Klein tool combination screwdriver. I used to take 4 screwdrivers, and finally one day, the light went on, and I said, I think I'll try one of those combo things. And I've never looked back and never really had a problem. I take a retractable utility knife with spare blades. I take a roll of Scotch 33, maybe 2 rolls, and I take a Sharpie. Because believe it or not, sometimes you have to mark things. And if you don't have some way to do that with something that's kind of quote unquote indelible, you'll regret it. With that collection, you should be able to do anything and everything on most any tower or any Yagi that you encounter. It's really pretty simple. And that gets the weight down. That's the important thing. I utilize lots of rock climbing gear, carabiners, pulleys. The pulleys I use are what are called the CMI rescue pulleys. They're aluminum. They're very lightweight, and they open. They slide apart. The two sheaves slide apart, and you can put them on the rope at any point. You don't need the end of the rope. And boy, is that a time saver. Of course, I have rope and slings. Here, Express, by the way, as my preferred vendor. Each client is different, job is different, so it's difficult to describe what's needed, but typically this is what I'm carrying up there. 4 slings, 2 2-footers, and 2 4-footers. And these are continuous slings, and they are the true workhorse of tower work this day and age, in my opinion. They allow you to do all kinds of rigging, and they're just terrific. Rope, of course, is a topic unto itself. We could do a whole hour presentation just on that. I have double braided rope, synthetic material, polypropylene. Of course, it's double the tower height and then usually an extra 100 feet on the end. So if you've got a 100-foot tower, you're going to need 200 feet of rope, and then I have another 100 feet, so that's a 300-foot rope. Take 2 base pulleys, which are much larger than the CMI rescue pulleys, and they are on swivels, and that allows the rope to, you put that pulley at the base of the tower, that allows the rope to go straight up the tower and then straight away from the tower base, so that anybody working with it or pulling on it or whatever is not standing there so something falls on that. I have 8 to 10 carabiners on my harness. I've got a capstan winch, a mighty capstan winch in the van. And I have, of course, several hundred feet of rope, along with a couple 100 feet of extension cords, and the tram line rope, which is a dedicated rope, by the way. It's only ever used for tramming. And of course, 2 other rope tubs for different lengths, 600 feet, 300-foot lengths, typically. If I'm going to go to the top of the tower for antenna work, I always examine the tower itself as I go up there. And I'm looking for bolt issues, i.e. a bolt that's loose. I'm looking for cracks, welds that have cracks in them. I'm looking for tape or cable ties that have come loose, i.e. the stuff that's securing the coax or the rotator control line to the tower itself, and looking for rust. And of course, since we're there probably to fix that intermittent or solve some other problem, we're not going to stop to do repairs to those quote-unquote items. So simply make a note of them, and you can do that by hollering down to the owner, and then you can come back and resolve them much later. Let's talk about some problem examples. Your antenna suddenly began showing different or erratic visual. And you know that because you've got that station notebook to look at. You suspect a feed line before hardware issues, always. And feed line care and condition is critical, of course, but again, it's taken for granted. You put it up, it's hooked up, it's working, fine. Never think about it again. But water ingress is almost always the issue, or it can be a connector issue. If I had $1 for every UHF connector that I saw that was unprotected or improperly installed, I'd be living in the Caribbean, no question. We'll talk about waterproofing or weatherproofing those connectors shortly. Here are the parts that you need to do that. You need some Scotch 33 or nothing, or 33 or 88, nothing else. Forget the 59-cent tape from the big box store. You throw that away. It's horrible. You want Scotch 33. This is a tape that's unknown by a great many hams, but it's truly marvelous stuff because it's linerless rubber. That means that it doesn't have any adhesive on it. That means you can wrap it directly around any coax connector. And unfortunately, I didn't put it in here, but I have a picture of a coax connector that I installed at N4ZC in 1989. And then I have a picture of what I looked like when I took this patient down in 2016. And the connectors look like the day I put them up. It's a tremendous, tremendous advantage and tool. But again, it requires special application, special use. You got to have a sharp knife or scissors, and we'll talk about that now. I'm sorry for this. I'm not going to go over each of those. I'm not going to read this to you and go over it each of the way, because I know that this is a presentation that you guys can reference. But the trick to using it is the first thing you do is you get the coax connector hooked up, and then you get those robo grip pliers out and you give that PL259 about 1/8 of a turn more. You make sure that it is tight. Trust me, if you don't do this, you'll probably have problems. The connection will probably turn out to be a diode, and you'll wonder suddenly, after a year or so, why do I have all these birdies on the bands? Well, it's because you got rectification of the RF, or now you got RF on the outside of your coax, et cetera, et cetera. So make sure you get that PL259 tight. And then you take a piece of the 133. If you feel it with your fingers, you'll notice that one side is slightly sticky, and that's the side that goes out. And then you wrap that around the PL2, you wrap that around the coax, and then go up onto the PL259, and you have a 50% overlap. That means that half the tape width is wrapped over the lower wrap. And you do that, and you keep tension on this, and you put enough tension on it so that the black 130C changes color to gray. Now, this is, of course, difficult to describe. It's easy to say this, but, well, Don, how much tension do I put on there? And experience is your best teacher. You just get it out, you practice with it once or twice, and you'll have it. And then, you're good to go. And then you wrap the entire connector, and you cut the end. You don't tug and pull and tear it. You cut it. That's very important, because if you don't do that, it'll invariably flag, i.e. flap in the wind later, which you don't want. The idea is to make the 130 a solid mass. So when you're done, you grip it with your fist and push it all together. And then now you're going to start at a little lower than where you started with the 130C with your 33 or 88. And you're gonna cover it completely. Again, 50% overlap. Again, you don't tug and tear it at the end. You cut it, you wait 5 seconds, and then you put that end down, and you repeat the process, i.e. two wraps of the 33 or 88 over top of that connection. Weatherproofed, waterproofed for all intents and purposes. If you have a choice, you should start at the bottom. You want to make that 50% wrap overlap. The idea is to make it look just like roofing shingle. Okay, hardware issues. Not using lubricant during initial assembly is a no-no. And by that, of course, we're talking about Noalox, Penetrox, stainless steel, or SS30, improper hardware. I prefer to use stainless if all possible. Or improperly sized U-bolts. This crops up more and more, it seems, especially with guys who ask me to install VHF antennas. Most of the things in ham radio these days are sized for a 2-inch mast, but a lot of the VHF, UHF antennas aren't that big. Quite common to run into 1.5 inches, and that's not going to fit on a 1/2-inch mast, so you have to, make a new boom to mast plate. And then, of course, here we come into this bugaboo, modifying commercial designs. The truss cable and trap covers on high gain antennas. You just basically have to replace that truss cable. It rusts up in about 2 weeks, and I'm not kidding. I mean, it's a bad thing. Philly strand, of course, is great if you have, if you have the Nyco press fittings, or you don't mind using cable clamps. I hate cable clamps. I don't like them anymore. And then, of course, replacing regular nuts with nylock connectors is a good thing. I especially do that on high gains because the nuts are on the bottom half of all the element to boom joints. And, in the wind, they can vibrate loose, but a nylock will mitigate that problem. And then, of course, there's the question, we're talking about PL259s or UHF connectors. I won't get into the debacle of whether you should use an N or a VHF connector. In my opinion, you should just use the UHF connector for absolutely everything. Of course, up in the gigahertz range, it makes a difference and all that, but I hardly ever do any work up there. It's nosebleed country as far as I'm concerned. And the UHF connector is fine. It's got so much more center pin connectivity than any N. It's just terrific. But there's only one connector that you basically should use. That's the Amphenol 83-1SP. 83-1 sugar papa. That's for silver plated. But in the last 5 or 6 years, I've gotten into using the Amphenol Connex connector, the 182-120. And I'm sorry that I didn't put it in here, but if you ever saw one, you'll see why I rave about it so much. It does not have 4 tiny little holes that you have to solder through. It has 2 slots. They have connected 2 of the holes with a slot or a groove, if you will. And that allows you to put more solder in much quicker because it heats up faster, and it's just a terrific connector. Again, Amphenol, it's silver plated and the dimensions are right. I always caution or, harp on this, but, the 89-cent coax connector that you buy at the Hamfest, you have no idea where it came from or where it was made. And I've encountered lots of connectors that are not the right size. It seems like there's no standard anymore. And I guess it's because that connector is so old and there's no quote unquote trademark or copyright, not copyright, but trademark protection. So anyway, the 83-1SP, the 182-120. And I buy them all from the RF Connection in Frederick, Maryland, in Gaithersburg, Maryland. The owner's a PVRC member, a friend of mine, and I've never ever had a problem. Rotators. We're talking about tower maintenance and stuff. So let's talk about rotator issues. They're always seemingly taken for granted, but they really can't be because the failure can be attributed to overloading, improper alignment, improper cable choice. I once had a guy who ran 300 feet of Cat5 cable up to his big Pro Sistel, and he wondered why when he pressed the rotator button, the rotator went, It was very interesting at trying to explain I2R losses to him. But anyway, water ingress is also a problem. Almost all the manufacturers provide voltage and resistance readings for their products, but in every ham situation where I've gone up to do a rotator swap or repair, the client has no idea what these were for their particular model rotator, which I always thought was kind of surprising. But it's like if your car breaks down on the highway, you call AAA or you call the garage, you have it taken to the garage because nobody really understands the mysteries of the internal combustion engine. Anyway, because of their unique nature and the necessity of turning your Yagi for optimal performance, I recommend that you have a spare or a replacement rotator on hand. And a lot of people jump up and down and say, you want me to spend $700 or $1,000 just to have a spare rotator sitting on the shelf? And the simple answer is yes. Yes, I do. Here's where we depart from the typical PowerPoint presentation. It came to mind while I was doing all this that I'm offering up opinions. So I thought I would simply do just that in lieu of trying to present a totally organized show, i.e., here's this, I'm going to talk about it, here's a picture of it, and so on and so forth. So from here on in, it's a stream of consciousness presentation. Towers. Let's get back to the beginning. Is it a guide or a self-supporting tower? Well, obviously, if it's a guide tower, you're going to have guide wires. And so what you should do is measure the tension on those guy lines. And you can do that, and not measure, but you can go over and pick them up with your hand and give it a snap. And if you see more than one oscillation, you probably know that it's too loose. The loose gauge is, of course, LOOS, loose gauge, thing that's used and designed and used for sailboats, but it works fine for ham radio towers. I actually had the so-called audacity to measure the loose gauge against the commercial tension gauge. It cost $3,000, and they were within 10% of each other, all the way up to 3/8 inch guy wire, EHS guy wire. So I decided that was then and there that was good enough for ham radio use. Crank up towers, boy, that's a real interesting question. I understand that they're necessary evil, or sometimes the only thing you can have. But of course, crank up towers prevent unique and special kind of problems. And of course, there's no easy answer to any of these. The question always comes up, should I, lubricate the cable? And, the manufacturer says that I should do that. But if you do that, you'll find that now the cable is sort of not sticky necessarily, but it is wet, and it will attract dust and debris, which will lead to further failure. So I don't recommend doing that, but I have done it for many clients who, insisted that we do it. It's not hard to do, but it's a messy job. But the critical thing on a crank up tower are the sheaves. That is the pulleys that are on the tower where the cable travels through them. And the weak, and of course, most of those have a Zerk fitting on them so they can be greased. And that should be done at least once a year, maybe twice a year. And of course, it's a pain in the butt to do because you got to get up at least 23 feet in the air most of the time. And the other problem is, since it is 23 feet in the air, is it working or not? I don't know. You look up there, it's all painted gray. It's hard to see. So the first thing I recommend doing is painting a line or a stripe or a dot or something on that sheave so that it's easily determined from ground level whether or not that sheave is actually turning. The other thing, of course, again, most people don't know this or think about this, but that cable that goes around or over that sheave is on the inside crimped, not crimped necessarily, but pushed together. And on the outside of that cable, it's stretched apart. So that's uneven wear, which is always a bad thing. So just every few, months, you go out and you move that crank up tower, a foot, let's say, or at least 6 inches. Moving that cable to a new location saves that crank up tower cable life expectancy considerably. The guide tower, of course, offers the most bang for the buck in terms of cost, initial cost, load carrying capabilities, expansion, etc. If you want to go, let's go 10 feet higher. Well, that's going to be awful tough with, the old crank up. If you got questions, you should always ask a professional. They'll more than likely be easily able to answer your question, willing to help you. And of course, there's shameless self-promotion here. I don't make a dime, so I'm not getting rich. But there is ARRL's publication of antenna towers for radio amateurs. It's now in its 3rd printing. So, and they reduced the price by $10. So, guide tension. Again, I've already said the loose gauge works fine. You should always inspect all wires and hardware. You should look at the plumb of that tower, check for twists, etc. You look at the base in detail. I got half a dozen pictures of tower bases that were simply ignored. One of my most famous one is a 45G tower that had been up for 28 years, and the guy never looked at it. And it was covered by lawn clippings, dirt, and debris, and then of course it would rain. That holds the water and moisture, and the leg just simply rusted through, literally. And then I had one in Atlanta where a guy called us up and he wanted to put up a new antenna. And we got there and we looked at it, was a 90 feet of 25G, and 2 of the legs were gone. They were gone. They were just no longer there where it came out of the concrete. And of course he did ask me, he said, well, you can climb it, can't you? And of course we didn't. But anyway, you should look at the base and make sure the debris is cleaned at all times. And there's a big gun contest station. I won't mention the call, but I ended up having to redo all his bases because he had not done that. So even the best of folks sometimes have a little problem. Let's talk about climbing itself. One of the things you're going to do as you climb, we talked about this briefly at the beginning, is you want to look at hardware items, i.e. you want to look at the diagonals, you want to look at the horizontal braces, especially pay attention to the hardware at guy brackets, where of course there's not undue, but excessive forces put on tower. Coax control lines. This is always a tough one. I have some clients who've insisted that I not, replace their coax. I had a client in Alabama whose outer jacket was completely gone on his RGA for like 6 to 8 feet. And I said, well, we just simply need to replace this. And he said, I don't have the money. So he insisted that I tape it the entire 6 to 8 feet. As I recall, we used up 2 rolls of 88 doing that. But boy, oh boy. Cuts and cracks, of course, those are all bad things, because what happens is you got water ingress. And that's, of course, always a bad thing. You look at you cut the jacket back and you look at the braid and it's black or green, and you just don't know how far that goes. But that coax is no longer any good. So people often ask where I put those, the coax or the control line, and I put as many as 11 hard lines and rotator line up a tower once. And that's what got me started on, instead of trying to put it on the side rails, i.e. the leg, I decided to dedicate one face. There are 3 faces, of course, on a triangular tower, and we just dedicated, and that's what we do now, one of the faces to the coax and control lines. And I find that works really well. The nice thing about it is it allows you to get those things, still straight. They're not jumbled up anymore. Heliax, of course, I'm a big believer in that. I'm a big believer in that for primarily the simple reason that Rosenberger Leone, who's the largest manufacturer of heliax in Europe, opened a warehouse in Charlotte. And a number of years ago, and they had a quote unquote grand opening to which I was invited. And as I was walking through the warehouse with the vice president, I said, what are those spools over there? And he said, no, those are all our short ends. He said, anything less than 300 feet, we consider it a short end, and we don't know what to do with them. And I said, I may be able to help you. They've loved me ever since. Rotator loops, always a topic of controversy, because, a lot of people don't like the big loop hanging in space, but I do. I like it over all the other methods, i.e. wrapping it in glass, laying it on the top shelf, et cetera, because you can tell at a glance if you have a problem. And to me, that, is always a good thing. Of course, as I said, you should have a station notebook where you have any feed line loss or VISWAR issues in prior years that you can consult. it gets you, ahead of the game right away. Ropes, a lot of us have ropes on our towers holding up dipoles or inverted V's, et cetera, et cetera. You want to look at wear and tear on that rope. And then, of course, if you've got a rope up there, you probably want to lower it or lower the antenna. So you're going to have a pulley. And the same kind of thing applies with the rope that applies to that crank up tower lifting cable. The rope is going to be compressed on the inside. It's going to be expanded on the outside of this pulley. And so, every few months, you should move that around a little bit. Okay, antennas. It's a great topic, of course. JK antennas are my antenna of choice these days. For many, many years, it was Force 12. But then, of course, they changed hands. Things got out of control, et cetera, et cetera. But JK offers designs that are just simply terrific. The Navasa, the XR series, they're mid-tri and they're mid-tri 40. And then they bought the designs from the original Force 12 for the old designs, and they've all been computer optimized and updated. Ken Garg, the owner, is a very, very good computer designer. They use super quality materials, all 6061 T6, all CNC machine. They're the only antenna I guarantee they're the only antenna you can buy these days. You'll take the parts out of the box, you'll put it together, and you won't have had to drill anything or get a file out because it's all CNC machine. They're just terrific. They just are terrific. High gain designs are still around. They find it very popular, especially popular here in the South for some reason. You got the classic TH series. You got a TH2, 3, 5, 6, and 11. They're all quite rugged, but they're trapped element designs. Another reason to possibly switch over to the JKs because there's no traps. They're all using the closed couple resonator theory. Koostcraft have been around forever, of course, and we've all probably got some experience with them. Their 2 and 6 meter beams are great. The A3 and A4 design, their Wark antenna. And then simply the best shorty 40 out there, the XM240. It's an upgraded, improved, whatever you call it, 402 CD. The terrific antenna, terrific antenna. And then, of course, my favorite monobandiagi is what's called the OWA, the Optimized Wideband Array, designed by Jim Breakall, WA3FET. Well, W3TX of Super Bertha fame. Now, their webpage is still up, but, sometimes sending an email to Scott is, I don't know what happens to them. He's a veterinarian in real life and has, he's busy, so who knows? And he was trying to sell the business a few years ago, so I don't know. But those are great antennas. We put up dozens of them, literally, at NR5M and K9CT, for example. And they're just terrific antennas. They really, really are. Mosley, I don't know any big gun guys who are using Mosleys, but they are rugged antennas. They kind of, I think of them in the same breath as the old Telrex design. They're just big and heavy antennas. I'm not sure they've got, computer design behind them, but they're rugged, that's for sure. Hex beams, I encounter this from time to time. I personally think the best was the K4KIO model. Some clients rave about them, and I admit an antenna that weighs 11 pounds and covers 20 through 10 meters is impressive. But personally, I think aluminum booms and elements are better. And then, of course, we've got Step IR. I know Mike Myrtle, the company owner, designer, president. Personally, it's a simply superb idea. And when they're working, they work very well. But moving parts aloft, let's rethink that. Because when they fail, they have to come to ground for repair. And they seem to be overly susceptible to surges or spikes and so forth. I've now repaired more of them than I've initially put up. When they first came out, I put up 5 of the monster IRs, and I was quite taken with them. And actually, discovered, or not discovered, but came up with a number of modifications, which were all detailed in an NCJ article once upon a time. And Mike was very impressed. He told me that and said, I want you to come up with I want you to just come up with whatever an antenna of ours that we make, and I'm going to just send it to you. I said, well, just pay me, but they never did. But anyway, they got to come to ground to get repaired. And like I say, I've now taken down more to repair than I've initially installed. DX Engineering, of course, is a great source of design and parts used to construct verticals or beams and so forth. They're high quality parts, bar none. I mean, their Super Duty saddle clamps are just the only thing I've found that'll hold a 80-meter beam in place on the mast. Just terrific. I'm sure having K4ZA as the CEO makes a big difference, but I can't say enough about their service. Okay, back to rotators. You got to pay close attention to the manufacturer's specifications. And when I say that, once upon a time, I was hired to take down an 80-meter Yagi. And I share this story with you as levity. We got to the site, and it was a 3-element 80-meter Yagi, to create design. And I looked up and I said, well, golly, isn't that a tail twister up there? And the guy said, yeah, it is. And I said, well, how's that working? And he was a Southerner, and I hate to do it this way, but he said, well, I pushed the button and nothing happened, and then it started turning. So it got to where I wanted it, and I let off in the brake, but it just kept going. And so that was somebody who didn't pay close attention to the manufacturer's specifications. Anyway, you try to match those specifications to the load or to the workload that you want to put up on the tower. By the way, that was on the 80-meter beam was on a 25G tower, if you can believe it. And I was very young and stupid and climbed it. Anyway, you want to always make sure that the rotator is plumb and centered within the tower. I can't emphasize that enough. I mean, it doesn't take much to get out of plumb, and it doesn't take much for being out of plumb to cause problems. And of course, the other thing that you need to do, and nobody does, is it's dynamically balance the antenna that you're going to put on that rotator. And you say, well, how do I do that? Well, it's not so easy, but it's also not that hard. You just basically lift the antenna at the rotator boom to mast plate, and then, stand back and look at it and see which way it's tilted. And invariably, when you do that, the one end will go up and one side will go up and one side will come down. And you'll say, now what do I do? And you go to Walmart and you buy a $4 fish scale. And then you go to the end that's up in the air, you put the fish scale there and you pull down. Then somebody is standing off to the side and says, oh yeah, hey Don, that's level now. That's a great idea. And you look at the fish scale and it says 4 pounds. And then you go, now what do I do? I got to put 4 pounds in the nose. And the typical thing to do is to get a piece of galvanized water pipe. You know how much that weighs. It's 2.08. And you measure out, just slightly over 2 feet. You insert that in the end of the boom with a stainless steel bolt, and you dynamically balance that boom or that antenna.
And she says, how?
Okay, somebody was chatting there. I recommend Loctite on the rotator nuts, i.e. the base bolts. It's not uncommon to sometime walk out to the tower and go, what are these 4 bolts laying here? And why is my antenna not turning right? That's because in Mother Nature's, vibrating and wind and, so on and so forth, those bolts have backed out. But Blue 242 Loctite will solve that problem. Also put it on the U-bolt, mast bolts. It can be removed with hand tools. Make sure you don't get the red Loctite, because then you'll be up there with a torch. But the Blue 242. So those are your choices. You high gain, ProSystel, the M2 from Orion, Yaesu, Prop Pip motors. Although with K7NV passing, those will become even more difficult. Then you've got Alpha Spid and so on. Well, I recommend and use the high gain AM4 and T2X design with a very high success rate. And I like these rotators because that bell-shaped design remains the only rotator that is really waterproof. The Yaesu rotators are rugged. We had a 2800 at K4ZA turning a 15-meter OWA. That's a 40-foot boom antenna for 20 years. And we did not have one incident. But the pot metals case will scare you. And their recommendation to pin the mast probably could give you a heart attack. Because if you over tighten the clamps, it'll cost you a pretty penny to replace that clamp. The control box, however, is very, very nice. ProSystel designs are quite rugged, although early models were prone to water ingress and their control box and the attendant software were simply inefficient. The M2 Orion 2800 is a rugged workhorse antenna, but I think it's a tad optimistic in terms of its rating. I can tell you that without hesitation, they'll turn a full-size 40, but they will not hold it. Factory clamp is woefully under-designed, getting used the K7NB designs now sold by DX Engineering. And like the ProSystel, get a green hair and control box. Problem solved. Little ring rotators. You've got limited choices here. K0XG, who's possibly gone out of business. It's impossible to get a hold of them. But those would be my first choice because they are the Ne plus ultra of orbital rings. They're just totally rugged. W2GD and I have installed 32 of those at NR5M. I speak from experience. Hook ring has a new design supposedly, but has a long history of limited documentation. And Carl's support of the original design is simply unavailable. ProSystel's ring is very nice. It's being largely stainless steel. The Alpha Spid design is also very nice, and their self-adjusting software is a true marvel. As we used to say in television or film, that's a wrap. But there's time for some Q&A, I think. I don't know how you want to do this. Just jump in and call, or maybe Kevin wants to oversee it or whatever. But there's time for that.
Well, Don, this was great. It was, I hate to say this, better than I expected it to be. A lot of good information. So, yeah, do we have any questions for Don? Here's your chance.
Where would be the upcoming YouTube presentation for all this stuff from Don? It's great, but I can't take notes fast enough. I'm traveling right now, so it's going to be a couple of weeks, but it will be up on our YouTube channel. You can find that by going to our webpage. Okay, what's the webpage?
MadisonDXClub.org.
Oh, easy enough. Thank you.
Yeah, and if you look at the invite for today's meeting, all that information is on there.
Got it. Thank you.
And when you get to the website, it's the first radio button on the left. It will take you to all the programs.
Got it.
Other questions?
It's no problem if there are not questions.
Well, I'm Don, I just want to thank you again very much. When we post the video, we'll put Don's webpage there, and there's a contact form if you have some questions for him. I have his book that's available at ARRL. Great book, great resource. So be sure to take a look at that. And I'll thank Don formally and